I was in my third and final year at university, studying archaeology. Due to recurring and severe illness in the second semester of my second year, I'd been unable to complete several core subjects and had to repeat them. This included an archaeological field school held in the mid-year holidays, where you would implement the techniques you'd already learned. This field school was compulsory if you wished to enroll in a particular subject, though not everyone studying was headed in that direction. I had successfully completed the previous year's field school, but due to my illness, was unable to complete the associated course, so I had to retake them both again. My university had a number of campuses dotted around the country and some overseas. The field school was offered to students on 2 campuses, the main campus located in the north, and one of its offshoots, located even further north. The field schools were held in the area of the main campus, so those participating were required to travel to attend. For some, it was across town. For others, it was several hours in a car. Needless to say, those attending from the sister campus did not do so lightly or cheaply. My lecturer, whom we'll call Matt, was a bloody legend. He was a brilliant lecturer, had authored 2 books, and was still working in his field, albeit at a different university than the one in this story. He knew his stuff, was easygoing, friendly, would sit and share a pitcher of beer with you on a Friday afternoon, and I only ever saw him angry once. This was important for later. The grading system went as follows: high distinction for 85 to 100%, distinction for 75 to 84%, credit for 65 to 74%, pass for 50 to 64%, pass conceded for 48 to 49%, and fail for anything below 50%. Matt and his counterpart at the sister campus had been granted permission to conduct this particular year's field school in a gully adjacent to a historic and protected cemetery. This gully actually split the cemetery in 2 and was used basically as a garbage dump. Due to the nature of the gully, there was only space permitted for a specified number of dig sites. Groups were to be allocated a site once they arrived on the first day, after they had decided on their members. As I was living on campus and had no car, I knew I'd be unable to arrive at the field school at the specified beginning times. I'd be half an hour late on the Friday and Monday mornings, and a full hour late on the weekend. I'd spoken to Matt about this, and as we knew each other quite well and had shared pitchers of beer quite often, he agreed that I would not be penalized for arriving late, but that I'd most likely be allocated a group to make up numbers, rather than choose my own. Friday rolled around, and I arrived at the site a half hour late. All was good, and I was introduced to my group. There were 4 of us, myself, the only female in the group but experienced in how the field school was run due to my previous year. Gazza, an older, grizzled male geology student who was taking the course just as a matter of interest. Bazza, a young male geology student who, by all other indications, was heading towards a lucrative career in the mining sector. And Dazza, another young male geology student, good friends with Bazza, also heading towards a lucrative career in the mining sector. All 3 of my counterparts were from the sister campus, so had traveled at some expense to attend. They'd already been allocated a dig site, and when introduced, Matt told them I'd got field school experience, so to utilize my knowledge. Bazza and Dazza smiled and nodded, giving me a friendly wave. Gazza grunted, but a little later, while surveying our area, we got to chatting. He was a nice enough guy, just a bit annoyed he'd been put in a group with a bunch of young troublemakers, and was worried he'd be carrying us or keeping us in line. "No worries, mate," I told him. I was here to get work done, get the data I'd need for next semester, and hopefully enjoy myself as much as I had the previous year. Now let me tell you, Lara Croft and Indiana Jones have royally messed up the perception of the general public when it comes to archaeology. A lot of what happens on an archaeological dig is repetitive and monotonous. You survey your area using surveying equipment, sketch and take photos of your allocated site before measuring out your 1 meter by 1 meter dig pit. You take more pictures and sketches of the untouched pit, as well as taking an initial soil sample. You scrape off a layer of earth. This is a layer of a predetermined depth, in this case 5 centimeters, And once done, you test the pH levels of the soil you've removed, documenting everything that you've scraped up. Yes, more photos and sketches. Then you take more photos and sketches of the pit and anything that may be lodged in there before scraping off another layer. If you hit an object, you remove the soil from around it, but don't actually remove the object until you are removing the layer of soil from beneath it. It must remain in place to preserve the data. Boring, I know, but this was also very important for later. Also important to note was soil composition in relation to how deep you could safely dig your pit before extending the boundaries to prevent soil contamination or the walls collapsing. Our dig site had quite loose, sandy soil, so it was announced that every 50 centimeters down, we would have to extend the sides of the pit by 50 centimeters on each side. It wasn't anticipated that we'd get much beyond 1 meter down. Definitely not further than 1.5 meters, so we'd only need to expand once, possibly twice. This was how they had divided up the entire site to fit us all in. It became very clear very quickly that neither Bazza nor Dazza had anticipated how monotonous the next 4 days were going to be. Both Gazza and I had to repeatedly call them over to assist us with surveying, and when it came to the soil scraping, they were excited at first, but then became bored as we had to yet again record every minute detail. As I was the only one who had thought to bring my camera along, one that required actual film, as this was before inexpensive digital cameras, smartphones were at least 10 years away, and I was a poor university student. I was the one responsible for taking photos. This included candid shots of the entire field school, other groups, the lecturers, and our dig site. Day 1 of the field school ended, and we all headed back to wherever for the night to kick back, relax, and prepare for another day of work. The next morning, Saturday, I arrived at the field school 1 hour late, at 10 in the morning, as per the bus schedule. Seeing as how I'd already had this approved by Matt, I wasn't anticipating any issue with my tardiness. I got to the cemetery and seeing Matt, gave him a cheery greeting. Matt turned and glowered at me. I mean, if looks could kill, I'd be right at home in that cemetery with all the other dead people. You know how I mentioned earlier how easygoing and laid-back Matt was, and I'd only ever seen him angry once? Well, this was that time. Matt was pacing, teeth grinding, fists clenched. He was absolutely furious. "Just get to your group and get to work," Matt practically snarled at me. I was worried now, thinking he was angry with me for being late, even though we'd previously squared it. I was nervous and worried, because we'd had a really good rapport in the past, and now I was thinking that I'd done something that was going to make my last semester at university hell on earth. Have I done something wrong? I know I was late, but like I told you before the field school, this was the first bus I could get out here. I'm really sorry if that's a problem. Matt sighed and shook his head. No, it's not you. You've done nothing wrong. I just can't deal with it right now. So just go to your dig site and get on with it. I'll talk to you later. I headed to my dig site, and what I found there almost had me in tears. When we'd packed up the previous day, our pit was 1 meter by 1 meter square, with a depth of 30 centimeters. I now stood before a 1 meter by 1 meter hole in the ground, dug down to a depth of approximately 3 meters. There were mounds of sandy dirt surrounding our pit, and I could see a multitude of objects that had been excavated just sitting there. Other groups were staring at us, but trying to look as though they weren't staring. Nobody would speak to us either. Gazza was livid. The dude was almost apoplectic. Bazza and Dazza were both looking very pale, and like they wanted to vomit. I was completely shocked, asking what the hell had happened here, and who had done this. It turned out that after everyone had left the site on Friday night, Bazza and Dazza and another mate of theirs in another group, we'll call him Gazza, got together and got drunk. It was during this that they decided to continue digging our pit, so they broke into the cemetery with a shovel. They proceeded to dig down until one of them passed out drunk at the bottom of a 1 meter by 1 meter hole in loose, sandy soil. The fact that the guy managed to wake up and make it out of the hole without the entire thing collapsing in on him was a miracle in itself. Matt had been called out to the site at 3 in the morning by the police, who had been called because one of the residents in the area saw something suspicious going on. Needless to say, Bazza, Dazza, and Gazza were all in serious trouble. They couldn't leave until they'd sobered up, but had been told that, in no uncertain terms, after the field school finished that day, they were to pack up and leave. Matt and his counterpart would deal with booting them from the archaeological program on Tuesday, after the field school ended. This left Gazza and me in a completely messed up situation. Luckily for him, Gazza was able to join the group that Gazza had been part of, especially since the group were all from the sister campus. I, on the other hand, was left hanging. There were no other groups that could take me, and besides, something had to be done about the disaster that was my dig site. So Saturday ended up with me trying to document whatever I could, and to keep Bazza and Dazza out of my hair, I gave them my camera and told them to take photographic documentation of every single piece of evidence that they had dug up. They had to use the scale measurement and a title board that was supposed to identify the item by date, location, layer level, and so on. So off they went with a miniature whiteboard marker, scale measurement, and my camera. This kept them occupied for most of the day, as there were in excess of 200 items that they'd unearthed in their drunken dig. I ended up filling in that hole, wishing with every shovelful of soil that Bazza and Dazza were still passed out drunk at the bottom. But such is life. Matt ended up attaching me to another group in an observational role, as the members of that group were all from my campus and would be in the same second semester class as me. Now, as I previously mentioned, the field school was linked to another class held during the second semester. This class essentially took all of the data and evidence that had been unearthed during the field school, and you examined, tested, collated, and then submitted a report based on those findings as your final assessment piece. Seeing as how I only had 1 day's worth of actual data and evidence, I could not submit the field school report as required. As this was a core class, and I didn't want to have to retake it for a third year, I approached Matt to talk about how we could rectify this into a situation where I would be able to pass and continue with my studies. After some discussion, Matt agreed to allow me to do a field school critique, using what had happened to me as essentially a how-to guide on how not to conduct or participate in a field school. I had the data from the first day to use in the class, and then the photos and sketches taken by myself and the troublemakers of the objects we'd excavated. After developing the film from the field school, I noticed some interesting things. The candid photos I took on Friday included shots of Bazza and Dazza not only behaving inappropriately, but interfering with the equipment we were using, and therefore possibly contaminating the data we had legitimately acquired. They were also shown to be in areas that we weren't allowed to be in, touching things that didn't belong to them, and also damaging ornaments left on some of the historic graves closest to the dig site. Then, there were the photos that they had taken on Saturday. They had apparently decided that because I wasn't overjoyed by the fact that they'd completely screwed me over by digging that hole, they'd make the only photographs of the artifacts they'd unearthed unusable by writing inappropriate comments and cursing towards me on the title board. One of the ones that stuck in my head was a large clay ceramic clam decoration, on which they'd written an obscene comment about body parts. This was the only photo of the clam that had been taken. When we filled the pits back in, we had to rebury the artifacts, so I couldn't just take a new picture. Also, over 200 pieces had been unearthed, remember? Matt had told me to use everything I'd gathered to write my report. So I used every single photo, including the ones that called me vulgar names and alluded to wishing sexual violence on me. At the end of the semester, I submitted my report, knowing full well that the best I could hope for was a pass, but that was enough to get me through to my final year. I found out what happened next from Matt at the beginning of my final year at university. So it turned out that when Matt had booted the troublemakers from the archaeological program, they had been allowed to continue on with their degree studying geology, but they were not allowed to have anything to do with archaeology, and were on very thin ice. When I submitted my report and Matt saw the extent of what they had done, kindly documented by themselves for the most part, and just how badly they had screwed me over, He went absolutely furious. Gazza was fine, as the group he'd been moved to had all the appropriate data and had been able to submit a proper field report. Matt called a meeting with the deans from both campuses, the Department of Tropical Environments and Societies, which was the Geology Department, and the Department of Anthropology, Archaeology and Society, which was the Archaeology Department, for both campuses. He presented to them my field report and told them about how he'd been teaching me for the past 3 years. Had it not been for the illness affecting me during my second year, would have likely completed my degree at this point. He also spoke about my previous field school, my behavior, and said that had I not been forced to withdraw due to my health, and based on previous work I'd submitted, I would have likely received a distinction or high distinction on my work. The fact that I averaged credit and distinction during the time I was ill showed my academic prowess. The fact that the only grade he was able to give me for the report he currently had in his possession was a pass conceded was a blow to my academic record that was wholly undeserved. He said a lot of other things, but the end result was that Bazza and Dazza were not only expelled from the archaeological program, they were now booted from the geological one as well. Furthermore, they were expelled and blacklisted from the university itself, which meant they could never re-enroll, and any other universities they applied to would be able to see this and the reasons why. Essentially, they were blocked from being able to obtain any university degree in that area, and to enroll in any university for a different career. They would have to wade through oceans of bureaucratic red tape and jump through so many hoops they'd make an Energizer bunny jealous. Unfortunately, this experience soured me on archaeology as a career path. Luckily for me, I was able to pick up a couple of extra courses in history and English, and I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts, with a major in English literature and a minor in history and archaeology. Looking back on the entire experience years later, I realized just how close I came to having my entire academic career derailed by 2 immature idiots who couldn't handle a weekend of actual work. The field school had been something I was looking forward to, despite having to repeat it. I'd enjoyed my first field school the previous year, finding the meticulous work satisfying in a way that surprised me. There was something meditative about the careful scraping of soil, the documentation of every tiny detail, the patience required to properly excavate a site. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real archaeology, and I'd found my calling in it. That was until Bazza and Dazza destroyed everything in one drunken night. The morning I arrived to find that 3-meter hole, I felt like my entire future had collapsed along with those sandy walls. I'd already lost so much time to my illness, had to repeat an entire year of courses, and now this. It felt impossibly unfair. But Matt's support changed everything. When he told me I could write a critique instead of a standard field report, he was giving me more than just a way to pass the class. He was giving me agency in a situation where I'd felt completely powerless. Instead of being just a victim of someone else's stupidity, I became the documentarian of their misconduct. Every photo I developed became evidence. Every inappropriate comment they'd written on those title boards became proof of their character. Every candid shot showing them interfering with equipment or damaging historic graves became ammunition. I spent weeks working on that report, pouring all my frustration and anger into meticulous documentation. I detailed every protocol they'd violated, every safety regulation they'd ignored, every piece of data they'd contaminated. I included timelines, witness statements from other students, and of course, all those damning photographs. The photos they'd taken themselves were particularly devastating. They'd essentially created a comprehensive record of their own misconduct, complete with vulgar commentary that revealed their complete lack of professionalism or respect. When I submitted the report, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and resignation. I knew I'd done good work, but I also knew that the best grade I could possibly receive was a pass conceded, barely passing, because I simply didn't have the proper field data required for a standard report. It seemed like such an injustice. I'd done everything right, worked harder than most students, maintained my composure in an impossible situation, and documented everything with professional thoroughness. Yet my grade would suffer because of someone else's actions. I tried not to think about it too much as the semester ended and I headed into my final year. I focused on my other classes, on rebuilding my academic record, on proving that I was more than just that one disastrous field school. Then Matt called me into his office at the beginning of my final year, and I learned what had really happened after I submitted that report. He told me that when he first read through my critique, he was impressed by the quality of my work. The analysis was thorough, the documentation was impeccable, and my understanding of proper archaeological methodology was clear. But as he worked through the photographs, seeing the full extent of what Bazza and Dazza had done, his impression turned to outrage. He'd known they'd dug the unauthorized hole, of course. He'd been called out at 3 a.m. and had to deal with the police. He'd seen the disaster they'd created. But he hadn't seen the photos from Friday, showing them damaging historic graves. He hadn't seen the equipment contamination. And he certainly hadn't seen the vile comments they'd written on the title boards, comments that went far beyond juvenile humor into genuinely threatening territory. Matt said he sat at his desk staring at those photos for a long time, particularly the ones with threats of sexual violence written right there on official documentation. These weren't just immature students making stupid mistakes. These were people who deliberately sabotaged my work, destroyed irreplaceable archaeological data, damaged protected historic sites, and then documented their own contempt for me with disturbing threats. He told me he spent the entire weekend preparing his presentation for the deans. He compiled every piece of evidence, created a timeline of events, gathered statements from other students, and even some of the other lecturers who'd witnessed Bazza and Dazza's behavior during the field school. He pulled my academic records from the past 3 years, highlighting my consistent performance and the impact my illness had on my grades. He showed how I'd maintained a credit to distinction average, even while dealing with serious health issues, demonstrating my dedication and capability. Then he presented the field school critique itself, letting the quality of my work speak for itself. The deans were apparently silent throughout most of his presentation. When he showed them the photographs with the threatening comments, one of the deans from the sister campus actually stood up and started pacing. That was when Matt drove home his main point. I deserved a distinction or high distinction for this work. The only reason I was receiving a pass conceded was because of the limitations imposed by circumstances completely beyond my control. And those circumstances were entirely the fault of Bazza and Dazza, who had not only destroyed my field school experience, but had also damaged university property, broken into a protected historic site, contaminated irreplaceable archaeological data, threatened a fellow student, and documented it all themselves. The meeting apparently went on for hours, with input from both campuses' geology and archaeology departments. By the end, the decision was unanimous. Bazza and Dazza were expelled from both programs and blacklisted from the entire university system. The blacklist meant that their academic records would permanently show the expulsion and the reasons for it. Any university they applied to in the future would see that they'd been expelled for academic misconduct, destruction of university property, threats against another student, and violation of protected historic sites. The bureaucratic obstacles Matt mentioned weren't just metaphorical. They would literally have to petition multiple committees, provide character references, possibly undergo counseling, and basically prove they'd completely reformed before any institution would even consider accepting them. Matt told me he felt it was the least he could do after what I'd been through. He apologized that he couldn't change my grade. The rules were clear about what was required for higher marks, and I simply didn't have the necessary field data through no fault of my own. But he could make sure that the people responsible for that faced appropriate consequences. I left his office that day feeling a strange mix of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly, in knowing that Bazza and Dazza's stupidity had caught up with them so completely. But there was also sadness that my passion for archaeology had been tainted by the experience. I did end up graduating with my Bachelor of Arts, majoring in English literature, with minors in history and archaeology. After a gap year, I went back for my graduate diploma in secondary education. I became a teacher instead of an archaeologist. Sometimes I wonder what might have been if that field school had gone differently. But mostly, I'm grateful for Matt, who showed me that sometimes the system does work, and that standing up for yourself and documenting everything can lead to justice, even if it comes with a bittersweet aftertaste. And I hope that somewhere, Bazza and Dazza learned that actions have consequences, and that some drunken decisions can alter the entire course of your life.